In this video, I will show you how to work the Cartridge Belt Rib Stitch that is featured in my Morgan cardigan. Because I also work a slip stitch I-cord border with this stitch in this pattern, I will also be including that in this demo. And lastly, I'll be showing you how to read your knitting with this stitch pattern. This will help you avoid mistakes and make your knitting experience so much more enjoyable. So let's get started. I have a little swatch started here that has 27 stitches. This stitch pattern, whether you include the slip stitch border or not, needs to be worked over a multiple of 4 plus 3 stitches. So it needs to be a number that is first divisible by 4, and then you add 3 stitches to it. 27 works for this because 24 is divisible by 4, and then you add 3 stitches to get 27. So in the Morgan cardigan, let me first walk you through the instructions for row 1, the right side row. You will first knit 3 stitches. And then in brackets, it says to slip 1 with yarn in front, then knit 3. And because it's in brackets, that means you will repeat that sequence over and over again until you're instructed to stop. Which in this case, it says to work the bracket sequence to 4 stitches before the end. And then for your last 4 stitches, you will slip 1 with yarn in front, knit 1, and then slip 2 with yarn in back, which is your slip stitch I-cord edge. In this pattern, the slip stitch I-cord edge is created by always slipping the last 2 stitches at the end of each row. On right side rows like this, they are always slipped with yarn in back, and on wrong side rows, they will be slipped with yarn in front. Now let me show you how to work row 1. So to start, we need to do our knit 3. Now keep in mind that the first 2 and the last 2 stitches are that slip stitch I-cord edge. So it's always worked on the last 2 stitches. So we're not slipping anything right now at the beginning of this row. So I'm going to knit 3. Now one thing I'm going to mention is that on the right side row here, sometimes this I-cord is a little bit looser than on the other side. So one thing I like to do on right side rows is on the second and third stitches that I'm going to knit, I'm just going to give them a little bit of a tug after I knit them. So I'm doing my second knit stitch, and then I'm just going to give the working yarn a bit of a tug. And then when I go into that third stitch, I'm going to tug it and then knit it and then give another tug. That just helps to cinch things up on this end a little bit. Now we're going to work the sequence in brackets, which is to first slip 1 with yarn in front. So I'm going to take my working yarn and I'm going to bring it to the front of the work like this. Then I'm going to insert my right needle into the next stitch on the left needle as if to purl, so into the front of the stitch, just like this. And then I'm just going to slip it onto the right needle without working it. Then I'm going to take the working yarn and bring it to the back of the work again. So that's it. Then you will knit 3. So we'll be repeating that sequence of slip 1 with yarn in front, knit 3 over and over again until 4 stitches before the end. So that would be right here. So again, to slip 1 with yarn in front, I'm going to bring the working yarn to the front of the work, insert the right needle purlwise, so into the front of the next stitch on the left needle, and I'm just going to slip it over to the right needle and then bring the yarn to the back of the work again. Then I will knit 3. So now I will just continue that sequence to 4 stitches before the end. Okay, so I just finished a knit 3 and now I am at 4 stitches before the end. So now it says to slip 1 with yarn in front again. So I'll bring the yarn to the front, slip it, then bring the yarn to the back. Then it says to knit 1. And then it says to slip 2 with yarn and back. This is our slip stitch I-cord edge. So keep the yarn in the back of the work where it is right now, and then insert your right needle into the next stitch on the left needle purlwise, just like this, and slip it to the right needle, and then do it again one more time. So into the last stitch, insert it purlwise, and just slip it. So row 1 is complete, and we can turn our work. So now we're ready to work row 2 of the stitch pattern. Row 2, the wrong side, is written as follows. First, you will purl 2, then your bracketed sequence is knit 3, slip 1 with yarn in front. So it's very similar to row 1, except that you're first working knit 3 and then working the slip stitch with yarn in front. And you'll repeat that sequence this time to 5 stitches before the end. Then for your last 5 stitches, you will knit 3 and then work your slip stitch I-cord edge on a wrong side row, which is slip 2 with yarn in front. So let's work row 2 right now. So first I'm going to purl 2. But one thing I want to point out, you'll notice that because we had slipped the last 2 stitches on the previous row, that your working yarn is over here, not at the end. And that is totally fine. So we're going to purl our first 2 stitches. So to purl when your yarn is over here is the same as you would typically purl. So I'm going to insert my right needle purlwise into the front of this stitch. And even though the yarn is over here, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap it around the right needle and purl it. And then I'm going to purl the second stitch. Now we'll start our bracketed sequence, which starts with knit 3. So let me bring the yarn to the back of the work and knit 3. And then slip 1 with yarn in front again. So again, bring the yarn to the front of the work, slip the next stitch, bring the yarn to the back of the work. So then I'm going to repeat that sequence to 5 stitches before the end. Okay, so I just did my last slip 1 and we are 5 stitches before the end. So now it says to knit 3. And then work our slip stitch edge by slipping the next 2 stitches with yarn in front. So bring the yarn to the front of the work and insert the right needle purlwise into the next stitch and slip it, and then do the same to the last stitch. Okay, so now row 2 is complete and we can turn the work. And now we're ready to work a row 1 again. And just like the beginning of row 2, your working yarn is not at the end. I'm going to flip it over so you can see. It's 2 stitches in from the edge since we had slipped those last 2 stitches. And that's okay. So you still will knit the first stitch just as you typically would. So again, because row 1 starts with knit 3, I'm going to insert the right needle into the first stitch, and knit it just like I normally would. And then just like I had mentioned when we first did row 1, that second and third stitch, I recommend that when you go to knit them, that you give them a nice tug to keep this edge as tight as possible. So I'm going to insert my needle into the second stitch, knit it, and then give my working yarn a bit of a tug. And then when I go into the third, I'm going to give it a tug and then knit it again. So that is how row 1 started with the knit 3. Here's a tip for your right side rows where the slip stitch edge tends to cause some trouble with looseness. If your particular tension is a bit loose and you find that even with giving the stitches a bit of a tug like I just showed you, if it still looks a bit sloppy, you can try knitting the first 2 stitches through the back loop. That has helped some folks who had this particular issue. I will say though that you need to work this edge for at least an inch or so before it starts to look like it's supposed to. So don't be worried if at first it just doesn't look right. Keep at it and then judge after an inch or 2 if you think you need to do something to tighten it some more. This is why swatching first is so important to help get you comfortable working this stitch pattern and to figure out what works best for you. Now I want to talk about reading your knitting with this stitch pattern. I can't stress enough how important it will be to learn to read your stitches here. Reading your knitting is when you can visually see a stitch pattern, not just reading the written words of the stitch pattern on paper, and knowing where each stitch belongs in that pattern by looking for visual cues in the fabric. Reading your knitting is understanding a stitch pattern visually. The best way to read your knitting in this stitch pattern is to use the slip stitch column as your visual cue. I'm going to put my work down here. So you could see your slip stitches created this neat looking column. So see this right here? This column are all your slip stitches. When you are working on your current row, your knit 3 will always be centered over this slip stitch column. Let me show you. So we already did our knit 3 of row 1. So the next stitch was a slip 1 with yarn in front, and then we do our knit 3. So see how that second stitch is right above that column of slip stitches. So I'm going to do my knit 3. 1. Okay, so the second stitch is always going to be above that slip stitch column. 2 and 3. Let me show you again. So then we slip 1 with yarn in front, and then I'm going to go and knit 3, and I can tell right away, even before I start that knit 3, that my second stitch is going to be over that slip stitch column. So every time you work a knit 3, whether it's on the right side row or on a wrong side row, it will always look like this. Your second stitch of your knit 3, so your middle stitch will always be worked over the slip stitch column. So by knowing this, you'll know right away if your stitch pattern is off, and you can just tink back a few stitches instead of having to rip back rows and rows of knitting. So let me show you an example. So let's say I just did my knit 3. Let's say I forget to do my slip stitch, and I think I have to do a knit 3 again. So I'm going to go ahead and start knitting my 3, but then I realize right away, wait a second, my third knit stitch is over that slip stitch column. That can't be right. It always has to be the second knit stitch that's over that column. So before I could even go further, I know I made a mistake, and I could just tink back to where I know everything still looked okay. So to tink back, you just insert the left needle into the back of the stitch you just worked, and then just pull it out that way. So I'm going to tink back these. Okay, so now I know, okay, this looks fine because those are my 3 knit stitches. Oh, I must have forgotten to slip a stitch. So now I can go and do my slip stitch. And then I know, okay, great. Now I'm all lined up because I'm ready to do my knit 3, and my second stitch is over that column, that slip stitch column. Let me show you one more time. So we're gonna do our slip stitch, and then I'm ready to do the knit 3. And before I even start, I could tell right away, yep, I'm all lined up because my second knit stitch is right above that slip stitch column. I find that visual cue to be so helpful with this stitch pattern. So that is how you work the Cartridge Belt Rib Stitch in my Morgan cardigan, as well as how to read your knitting with this stitch pattern.